All right, we have traveled to the south and east of Cedar Bluff State Preserve and are visiting one of my favorite places. This is the Eddyville Dunes. This is a sand prairie complex, sand prairie and some wetlands that occur in this landscape here. Just to the east of Eddyville in northwest Wapello County, part of the public areas in Mahaska County as well. So Sand Prairie is one of the most interesting and unusual communities you could visit in Iowa. There's some others, but I like Sand Prairie quite a bit because Sand Prairie, of course, is very distinctive. The sandy soil makes a prairie that is much different, of course, from the black soil prairies that we are used to over most of the state. Obviously, with a sand prairie, you've got a situation of more porosity, greater amount of dryness. You've got less fertile soil. So it really brings in a whole complement of all kinds of other plant species and animal species as well that you don't typically see very often, at least in the state. Most of these sand prairies are in the, let's say, the eastern half of Iowa, and most of them are associated with a river valley. Is the origin of the sand is usually either partly alluvial or partly aeolian. Aeolian means it's sand that's been blown and deposited by the wind. I think here at Eddyville it's mostly wind-blown sand, and then hence the dune aspect. There is some elevation change here. So, and the sand's fairly deep here. I think it's over at least 50 feet deep in most places. So the first species we run into here as we walk into the sand prairie off the trail is this one right here, which of course is a very characteristic species of sand prairies. This is eastern prickly pear cactus. The cactus in Iowa have been, or the cactus in general, have been undergoing a fair amount of taxonomic revision. This is, at least in the Eilers and Rosa checklist, is known as Opuntia hemosfusa. I think maybe the scientific name may have changed now, but anyway, eastern prickly pear cactus. And it's, of course, very distinctive as cactus go. It's a succulent plant, meaning that it stores moisture in cell tissues to help cope with the dryness of the environment. It's reduced its morphology to mainly just stem tissue. All that we're seeing here is stem tissue that's modified into these flat pads, kind of enlarged flat pads that provide for the photosynthetic surface. These are called cladophylls. So it's a series of cladophylls that forms the basic structure of the plant. The leaves on these cactus are still here, but they're modified into the spines. Now these spines are kind of wore off here, but you know, all cactus generally have some kind of sharp, pointy structure. We call them spines if they're modified leaves to help protect the tissue, the succulent tissue, from critters that would want to eat it. And cactus have a very unique photosynthetic pathway as well. They have a pathway called CAM photosynthesis that helps again to conserve moisture, helps to prevent a process called photorespiration that's kind of wasteful, and that's how they're able to cope in a more stressful environment. Cactus are quite splendid when they're in bloom. We miss the bloom, of course, it's long past. Looks like with all the fruits that we're seeing here, all these are fruits in through here, that there must have been a really nice bloom a few months ago. So there's about 3 species, at least 3 species of cactus in Iowa. This one is the most common one, eastern prickly pear. It can be found throughout the state in the right kind of environments. You have to be in a sand prairie or a very, very dry, gravelly, sandy, gravelly type of prairie. The other cactus there's one species that grows up in the northwest part of the state, and that's more of a Great Plains species, and then I believe there's another one that's found somewhat more in the northeast. Opuntia humusfusa is the this is a scientific name, at least it was. All right, then we're going to take a look at a much smaller species right here. This is called Everlasting. It's a late summer, fall blooming species. Pretty small, kind of dainty. The flowers are not very showy at all. It's in the Asteraceae family. So it's got just some disc flowers here. The scientific name, again, originally was Nephallium obtusum. I believe that's changed now to, there's a new one, Pseudanthium, I think, something like that. But I think this is a good species to find out here in the sand prairie, or other dry prairies, dry sites, again with really gravelly soils. Everlasting. And then another one right close by here is, this one's a little more common in a lot of prairies in general, drier prairies, maybe even somewhat mesic sites. This is false bone set, Brachylia euperatoides. This too is in the Asteraceae family, and just has some disc florets there in the flowers. This one I always recognize, one thing that helps to recognize this species, I don't know if I can find a good leaf that shows the characteristic, but usually there's, on the leaves, there's usually just a few small teeth towards the base of the leaf. This one's not really showing it. Yep, none of these leaves really are. But it can be a pretty common species. It's a pretty good indicator of a prairie remnant when you find it. Brachylia euperatoides, false bone set. We're going to take a look at some of the grasses out here, because we do have some distinctive ones and some that are often found more on sand prairies. Here's a good example of the first one. This is purple lovegrass. So you can kind of see the little tint of purple rose coloration you can see in the inflorescence up here. These spikelets, which again, spikelets are the structure that contains the flowers of grasses. These are all really small. And there's usually 3 or 4 flowers just in one of these little spikelets here. So everything again with grasses is the flowers are very, very small. Need to have a hand lens or a dissecting scope to really see them, see what's going on there. But again, this one, you don't really need to look that close at the flowers. You can look at the entire plant, the entire inflorescent structure. Here's one of those inflorescent structures with a lot of branches, long branches coming out, branches coming off the branches, so compound branching. And again, those tiny little spikelets are arranged usually out towards the tips of those secondary branches. And again, the whole thing has this little bit of a tint of purple color that you can pick up in the right light. Eragrostis spectabilis is the scientific name here. Purple lovegrass. The leaves and the plant themselves, pull one out here. Here's a flowering stem and then the lower leaves. There's usually a lot of hair, or pubescence, at the base of the leaves, down and through here. You can see that hairiness kind of on the base of the blade here. And there's also, this helps to separate it from another Eragrostis species that can grow on sand prairies. In the inflorescence structure here, where the branches come off the main axis, there's little tufts of hair. You can see one really nicely right there. Another one right here at this branching point. Some more up here. So yeah, each of these places where branches come off, there's a little tuft of little white bristly hairs. Purple lovegrass, Eragrostis spectabilis. Alright, and then right over here, fairly close to it, actually just all over the place because this one's really common. It's just a real dominant species out here. I'm looking at a clump of it right here. All of these basal leaves, short little tillers with leaves, short little leaves coming off here. And then the inflorescence is one of these things right here. It has kind of a similar form as the purple lovegrass, again an inflorescence with long branches coming out. It has just a single spikelet at the tips of these branches. That's a little bit different. This is fall witchgrass. The scientific name was and is in Eilers and Rosa is Leptoloma cognatum. It's now listed or identified in Flora of North America as Digitaria species. I don't remember for sure what the species epithet is, but it's in the genus Digitaria. So it is, again, see this commonly on many sand prairies, so it's a good indicator of a sand prairie. Alright, those are two of the lower growing grasses. Let's take a look at a very tall and distinctive forb right here. Everyone will recognize this, I'm sure, as a thistle, which it is. This is a native thistle. The name is field thistle, Cirsium discolor. And one way to distinguish the native thistles from the non-native thistles like bull thistle and nodding thistle, and to some extent Canada thistle, is to take the leaf, look at the ventral surface, and I can see, and hopefully you can see, kind of just a really white surface to the ventral side of this leaf, very white. There's a lobe, you can see all that white coloration in through there. All of that white is due to a very short and sort of matted pubescence or growth of hairs, short little hairs that are white in color. So that is a good characteristic, pretty easy, pretty quick. Just look at the undersurface of the leaf. You see very clearly a dense mat of little white hairs. That's the native thistle. And native thistles, again, should not be persecuted to the extent that the non-native thistles usually are. Bull thistle and musk thistle are somewhat invasive and problematic. The native thistles, like this one, again, Cirsium discolor, field thistle, and again, one that looks just like this, tall thistle, they are, more important parts of the community. They provide important sources of nectar. These large flowers here are able to produce quite a bit of nectar for butterflies and other nectar-feeding species this time of year. I'm just looking at this now. I can see a couple of flies, possibly see bees, of course, butterflies, various species using these. And, as you may know, thistle seed, which is the product of these thistle flowers, thistle seed is a favorite food item of our state bird, the goldfinch. Again, there's two species that look kind of like this. The way to tell them apart, and the way I can tell this is field thistle, is the leaves. And most of the leaves, these are dried out down here, but these green ones and even these that are dried out. So the leaves that are in at least the middle part of the stamen through here, when you look at one of these leaves, you see it's very deeply divided. It's got these sinuses that come in and divide out and form these narrow lobes. So a leaf that's really deeply divided with these sinuses that come almost all the way down to the midrib of the leaf right there. That deeply divided characteristic, again, identifies this as Cirsium discolor field thistle. Tall thistle, which I think is a little bit more conservative, don't see it quite as often, has leaves that are not divided to this extent. They might be a little bit shallowly divided or kind of waved, kind of a wavy margin, but not divided this deeply. They will have all native thistles have this white coloration. Most of them anyway, I think, have this white coloration on the ventral side of the leaf. Alright, but most of you can recognize this one right here as a sunflower. Sunflowers are really good examples of, again, what's happening in what's called a ray flower and a disc flower. Ray flowers are these large yellow petaled flowers that are around the edge, and the disc flowers are these darker flowers in the center. So again, sunflowers have two types of florets, the ray florets and disc florets. This is the common sunflower, Helianthus annuus. Somewhat characteristic are these really big, relatively speaking at least, really big leaves that are very triangular in shape. These are much broader at the base than most any other sunflower leaves that you're going to come across. There is one species, another species that does resemble this species. This is Helianthus annuus, again the common sunflower. It's an annual species. There's another one that's an annual species, Helianthus petiolaris, that we can sometimes find. And the way to tell petiolaris from annuus is to look at these are called involucral bracts right here, these green things. Involucral bracts sit around the base and margins of the head inflorescence. So again, this is an entire flower here. These involucral bracts sit below and around the base of the receptacle where the ray flowers and disc flowers are attached. So we want to look at these bracts here, these involucral bracts, and if I can pull one up a little bit here. It has a very sort of ovate or round-shaped body, and then it tapers very quickly to this long, slender point. That long, slender point, and the fact that it tapers very quickly to this long, slender point, is a characteristic that can be used to separate this species, annuus, from the other species, petiolaris. The bracts on petiolaris would more gradually come down to a point. And then these abruptly come down to a very long, slender point. Alright, again, annual or common sunflower. This is the one that's used, of course, to grow sunflower seed, this species. Alright, then we'll look at a couple of grasses here. We're in a sea of blue stems here. This is big blue stem, and it has the characteristic turkey foot, somewhat three-pronged, at least in some cases. There's one that's kind of three-pronged inflorescent structures. So again, in the grasses, as I've said before many times, everything that's going on up here where the flowers are is kind of complicated, and everything is kind of small. The blue stems are even more complicated in terms of how the flowers are arranged and what's happening here. For our sake, again, we can just simply talk about the fact that there's basically usually 3 or 4 branches at the top here that have spikelets attached to them, and these spikelets have the little flowers inside of them. So again, it's just more the form of the inflorescence that we want to pay attention to here. Of course, the big blue stem is going to be, it is a tall grass, so generally it's usually up to 2 meters in height. A tall grass species, in contrast with little blue stem, This one right here, for example, which is about maybe only 3/4 that height, and again, being little blue stem, it's a midgrass species. That means it's better adapted to drier soils and would be more commonplace and abundant in drier climates, especially if you go just west a ways into the central Great Plains. This becomes a much more common species. In Iowa, since we are a tallgrass prairie climate, we have a tallgrass prairie climate, and most of our prairies are tall grasses, big blue stem is typically found more often. But again, in a sand prairie, because of the dryness of the soil, the lower fertility of the soil, a grass such as little blue stem and midgrass is probably actually more likely to be found. In fact, as we look around here, there's way more little blue stem than there is big blue stem. The little blue stem, besides from being obviously smaller, is in a different genus, Schizocheirum scoparium, and this is Andropogon gerardia. So it's a different genus, and it does have a little bit of a different structure to the spikelets and flowers. One way to, again, get maybe an appreciation, usually when little blue stem is getting close to dispersing its seed, you'll see these little curved inflorescence branches here, basically. Again, these have the little spikelets on them with the seeds and the fruits. So this obviously looks a lot different than the more three-pronged turkey foot kind of appearance that we see with big blue stem. The leaves on big blue stem are larger, as you might suspect, and somewhat wider than the leaves on little blue stem. So here's some little blue stem here, here's some big blue stem here. Actually, I can get a little bit better leaf here. This one's a little bit better. Here we go. Not quite as drastic as, so this is little blue stem here. This is big blue stem. Two very important grasses in the tallgrass prairie. Okay, we're going to look at 4 plant species here that are probably not real high on your list of favorite prairie plants, but they are native species. They grow in prairies. They certainly have an ecological role and function to play out here. The first one is a plant that we don't like to have around too much, probably. This is a ragweed, but it's not the common ragweed, which is much more weedy and certainly much more problematic as a pest, you might say. This is western ragweed, Ambrosia xylostachya, and it is a perennial species, and so it's a little more, at least, conservative in that respect. Like all ragweeds, though, it's going to have wind-pollinated flowers, and yes, all these ragweeds are the cause of allergies for many people, unfortunately. The allergies sometimes get blamed on the goldenrods because the goldenrods are blooming at the same time, but remember, the goldenrods are insect pollinated. You're not going to get pollen into your system generally with those species. It's going to be these wind-pollinated species. So western ragweed, again, aside from being perennial, which is one difference from the common ragweed, the leaves are usually just once divided. They're not quite as complexly divided as the common ragweed usually is. And usually the common ragweed has a little bit more of a petiole, distinct petiole, on those leaves as well. So again, western ragweed is typically found in drier prairies, often is associated with a disturbance or perturbation. I see it a lot of times in drier sites, drier prairies, for example in the Les Hill prairies after a burn with plants coming up from seed. Western ragweed, Ambrosia xylostachya. And another species that kind of fits that same role or function as being a little bit more of a a ruderal species is this one right here. This one is yellow lettuce, Lactuca canadensis. It's been eaten off here by a deer, it looks like, so we're just seeing some branches coming up here from below. This one has a yellow flower, hence yellow lettuce, and it's going to be most similar to prickly lettuce. Prickly lettuce is a non-native species, somewhat invasive, mildly invasive species, but a really good way to separate them is prickly lettuce on the undersurface of the leaf along this mid-vein. Prickly lettuce is very prickly. There's usually quite a few short, stout little hairs or prickles that are associated and growing off of that mid-vein on prickly lettuce. On yellow lettuce, we don't see that. The mid-vein might have just a few little hairs or short little prickles, but it's certainly not very extensive, not very much. And usually the leaves on prickly lettuce are not quite as wide and wavy or lobed as the leaves on prickly lettuce. Both of them do have yellow flowers. Again, in the lettuce genus, we're looking at flowers that are composed just of the ray florets. There aren't any disc florets. You can also kind of identify this one by this time of year. We're seeing the fruits here. So if we open up this flower here, I'm pulling out the achenes. You can see some, here's an achene on my thumbnail here. That's an achene, it's very flat. It has a slender little beak right there. Again, one way of separating this from the prickly lettuce is that the achenes on prickly lettuce will have lots of nerves, or basically lines, on the face of these little fruits here. And yellow lettuce here just has one main nerve or vein. Okay, again, that's yellow lettuce. This is Lactuca canadensis. All right, then right here in front of me is another native species that, again, you find usually in more disturbed prairies, a little bit more of a ruderal species. It is a perennial. You might recognize this as a type of solanum. Looks similar to nightshade with these fruits here. This is horse nettle, Solanum carolinense. It is a relative of black nightshade, and like black nightshade and other species in the Solanum genus, it produces a chemical called solanine that is a type of toxic glycoloid. So all parts of the plant are poisonous. So consequently, of course, it doesn't get really consumed at all by livestock. So one thing that you see certainly with horse nettle is if the prairie grassland has had maybe some overgrazing in its history or land use, that overgrazing will tend to provide an increase, a plant like this, which is an increaser under grazing, to become more numerous and even more abundant. It does have these pretty distinctive little fruits here, tomato-like fruits, you might say. It's in the same family. It's pretty distinctive, again, with the fruits, of course, but without the fruits, it is prickly. It does have some sharp hairs. Here's some prickles. Prickles on the underside of the leaf right here, on the mid-vein. So notice I'm using the term prickle. I've used the term spine. We could also use the term thorn. Prickles, spines, and thorns are all similar in their function and structure. I call them sharp, pointy things. But they differ in their origin and development. Prickles, like this, develop from hairs. Spines, which we saw on the cactus, or we could see on cactus, develop from leaves. And thorns, which we could see if we had an example of a honey locust tree, for example, or Osage orange tree, thorns develop from branches. And then one more. We'll look at one more species. Another species I see very often in sand prairies. It's this plant right here. Fairly oblong shaped leaves. Small, very small white flower. Tiny little flowers again. Need a hand lens to appreciate those and see what's going on there. This is hogwort. The common name is hogwort. Scientific name is Croton capitatus. It's an annual. By the way, that yellow lettuce is a biennial. So again, we see in the sand prairie, again, because of the nature of the soil environment, that it is a little bit better environment for annuals and biennials. Mainly because, again, the harsher environment poses some restrictions on the vigor of other perennial plants, so these annual species have a little bit more of a chance. Croton capitatus, or hogwort, is in the spurge family, so it's related to, for example, flowering spurge. That's the species we saw last time in Williams Prairie. The flowers are somewhat similar, but not quite the same as Euphorbia. This is a different genus, of course, Croton. One thing that's really distinctive about this plant, if you look at it with a hand lens or under the scope, you'll see that it has a pubescence on the leaves, on the fruits, on the branches, stems. That's kind of unique. It's got stellate pubescence. Stellate is a term meaning like a star. And so stellate pubescence is when we see little hairs that are all, a group of little hairs that are all joined at the base, and basically it looks like a branched hair then. And those little branches, usually there can be maybe 3, 4, 5 or so hairs joined at the base. Those hairs spread in all directions, sort of like a star. The point's on a star. Hence the term stellate pubescence. Again, you can see those. That's a good characteristic of this species. That stellate pubescence covers most of the plant. Croton capitatus, or hogwort.